I'm Melissa Warren, 32, and for the past 11 years, my family has treated me like their personal punching bag. The sister who destroyed a perfect family. The irresponsible one who caused the accident that left my little sister Amber in a wheelchair. Until last month, when I discovered a dusty police report in my father's home office that would shatter everything they believed about me and reveal a betrayal so deep it would fracture our family forever. Hey everyone, before I dive into this story that completely changed my life, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you've ever had family blame you for something that wasn't your fault, this story might hit close to home. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of real-life stories. Trust me, what I'm about to share about family loyalty, betrayal, and unexpected karma will make you question everything you thought you knew about blood ties. Growing up in suburban Connecticut, our family looked picture perfect from the outside. My parents, Richard and Diana Warren, were respected community members, Dad a prominent attorney and Mom the perfect homemaker who volunteered at every school function. Our colonial-style house with its manicured lawn and white picket fence was the embodiment of the American dream. Then there were the Warren sisters, Amber and me. From the moment she was born when I was 6, Amber became the golden child. With her bouncy blonde curls and infectious laugh, she was the spitting image of our mother, while I had inherited my grandmother's darker features. She's just like you, Diana. Relatives would coo at family gatherings, while I stood awkwardly in the corner, already feeling like an outsider. Don't get me wrong, I loved my sister fiercely. But the difference in how we were treated was impossible to ignore. Amber's finger paintings earned spots on the refrigerator. My straight-A report cards were met with perfunctory nods. When Amber joined the cheerleading squad in middle school, my parents attended every practice. When I made the debate team and qualified for nationals, they were too busy to drive me to competitions. That's just how parents are with the baby of the family. My best friend Taylor would reassure me when I confided in her. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was an unspoken hierarchy in our home, and I was firmly at the bottom. By the time I turned 17, I'd grown used to living in Amber's shadow. I focused on academics, knowing a scholarship was my ticket to freedom. I'd been accepted to 3 Ivy League schools and was counting down the days until I could leave home and finally build an identity separate from being Amber's sister. Then came May 15, 2012. The day that would become a dividing line in our family history. The before and after. It was a Friday afternoon and Amber, then 11, had a cheerleading competition. Mom had promised to drive her but got called in last minute to cover for another volunteer at the school fundraiser. Dad was in court. The solution seemed obvious. "Melissa, you need to drive your sister to her competition," Mom said, tossing me the car keys as she rushed out the door. No detours, straight there and back. I had planned to meet Taylor at the library to study for our AP exams, but I knew better than to argue. "Fine," I mumbled, grabbing the keys. The drive to the middle school was filled with Amber's excited chatter about her routine. Despite my resentment at being the perpetual backup plan, I couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. We were just 2 miles from the school when it happened. A pickup truck ran a red light, barreling toward us at full speed. I swerved instinctively, but it wasn't enough. The impact was deafening, the crunch of metal, the explosion of glass, Amber's scream, and then silence. A terrible, suffocating silence. I regained consciousness in the hospital with a concussion, a broken arm, and the news that would haunt me for years. Amber's spine had been injured. She might never walk again. What I didn't know then was that this accident wouldn't just change Amber's life. It would become the lens through which my family would view me for the next 11 years. Not as a victim of the same accident, but as its cause. If you had been paying attention, my father hissed in the hospital corridor, his face contorted with grief and rage. This never would have happened. "You were probably texting, weren't you? Or showing off?" I tried to explain, through tears and the fog of pain medication, that the truck had run a red light. That I'd tried to avoid it. that I'd been driving carefully exactly as they'd taught me. But they didn't want explanations. They wanted someone to blame, and I was the perfect target. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later, the narrative had been set. Melissa's reckless driving had destroyed her sister's life. And for the next decade, that story would define me, not just in my parents' eyes, but in my own. The years following the accident unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. As Amber underwent surgeries and intensive physical therapy, I became the family pariah. My high school graduation came and went with minimal celebration. How could we celebrate when Amber was learning to navigate the world in a wheelchair? My parents attended the ceremony out of obligation, their stiff smiles for the camera betraying their true feelings: disappointment, resentment, blame. I still went to college that fall, Yale, on a full scholarship, but the triumph felt hollow. The accident had cast a shadow over everything. My parents rarely called, and when they did, the conversations were strained, perfunctory. Updates about Amber's health. Questions about my grades, but never about my well-being. The unspoken accusation hung in the air during every holiday visit. You did this. You ruined her life. Have you thought about coming home after graduation? Mom asked during my senior year. Amber could use a sister around. You owe her that much. The guilt was a constant companion. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have been more careful, should have seen the truck coming, should have reacted faster. The rational part of me knew that a driver running a red light wasn't my fault, but after years of being told otherwise, doubt had taken root. So I did what they asked. Instead of accepting the job offer from a prestigious consulting firm in New York, I moved back to Connecticut. Found an apartment 20 minutes from my parents' house. Took a less demanding job at a local company so I could be available whenever Amber needed me. It's the least you can do, Dad would say when asking me to drive Amber to appointments or therapy sessions, as if my entire life had become a form of restitution. Amber, for her part, never blamed me outright. But she didn't defend me either. As she grew into a teenager and then a young adult, she absorbed our parents' narrative. Her life had been irrevocably changed by her sister's mistake. There were moments of connection between us, late-night conversations, inside jokes no one else understood, but they were always overshadowed by the unspoken burden of what had happened. I tried dating occasionally, but relationships inevitably crumbled under the weight of my family obligations and the perpetual cloud of guilt I carried. How could I explain to someone that my entire adult life had been shaped by atonement for something I wasn't even sure was my fault? You deserve to be happy too, Mel, Taylor would insist during our phone calls. She had moved to California after college and was always urging me to visit, to break free from the toxic dynamic I'd accepted as normal. But leaving felt impossible. The guilt was too deeply ingrained. Then came the pandemic. Like millions of others, I began working remotely. The isolation was difficult, but there was also an unexpected relief in the distance it created from my family's expectations. Video calls with Amber replaced in-person visits. For the first time in years, I had space to breathe, to think. It was during this period that I started therapy, initially just to cope with the anxiety of global uncertainty. But as sessions progressed, Dr. Lavish gently helped me examine the family dynamic I'd been trapped in. It sounds like you've been carrying responsibility for something that was beyond your control, she observed during one session. Have you ever considered that your parents' reaction might have more to do with their own guilt than with anything you did? The question rattled me. I'd been so busy accepting blame that I'd never stopped to question why they needed me to be guilty. Why they had latched onto a version of events that painted their 17-year-old daughter as a villain rather than another victim of a terrible accident. As restrictions eased and life began returning to some semblance of normalcy, I approached my family interactions with new eyes. I noticed how my father changed the subject whenever the accident was mentioned. How my mother would get a strange, panicked look if anyone brought up the details of that day. What were they hiding? The question began to gnaw at me, growing more insistent with each family dinner, each veiled accusation, each reminder of how I had failed my sister. After a particularly tense Sunday lunch in early 2023, where Dad had made yet another passive-aggressive comment about actions having consequences, I made a decision. It was time to confront the past head-on. Time to find out what really happened on May 15, 2012. I had no idea that my search for truth would uncover a betrayal far deeper than I could have imagined, or that it would set in motion a chain of events that would finally deliver the justice I'd stopped believing was possible. The decision to investigate the accident wasn't made lightly. For 11 years, I'd accepted my parents' version of events, that somehow, despite the other driver running a red light, I was ultimately responsible. Whether through distraction, poor reflexes, or some other teenage failing, the blame had been placed squarely on my shoulders. But Dr. Levine's questions had planted a seed of doubt that refused to be ignored. My first step was to request the official police report. Despite being directly involved in the accident, I realized I'd never actually seen it. In the chaos of hospital stays and Amber's diagnosis, the legal aspects had been handled entirely by my father. Given his profession as an attorney, this had seemed natural at the time. I drove to the local police department on a Tuesday afternoon, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. What if the report confirmed what my parents had always claimed? What if there was evidence of my negligence that I'd blocked from memory? I'd like to request a copy of an accident report from May 15, 2012, I told the clerk, my voice steadier than I expected. I was one of the drivers involved. The process was surprisingly straightforward. After filling out some paperwork and paying a small fee, I was told the report would be emailed to me within 3 business days. The wait was excruciating, each hour stretching like taffy as worst-case scenarios played through my mind on repeat. The email arrived on Friday morning as I was getting ready for work. My hands trembled as I downloaded the attachment, both desperate to know the truth and terrified of what I might find. The report was clinical, detached, a stark contrast to the emotional weight I'd attached to the event. There were diagrams of the intersection, statements from witnesses, descriptions of vehicle damage. And then, in black and white, the officer's conclusion: driver of Vehicle 2, Walter Jenkins, failed to stop at red light, causing collision with Vehicle 1. Driver of Vehicle 1, Melissa Warren, attempted evasive action but was unable to avoid impact. I read the paragraph 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. There it was, official confirmation that I had done nothing wrong. The accident had been caused, unequivocally, by the other driver running a red light. The report even noted my attempt to avoid the collision. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by confusion. If this information had been available all along, why had my parents insisted on blaming me? Had they never seen the report themselves? That seemed unlikely given my father's involvement in handling the aftermath. There was more. The report mentioned that the driver of the pickup truck, Walter Jenkins, had been administered a breathalyzer test at the scene, which showed a blood alcohol level of 0.14, well above the legal limit. He had been arrested for DUI and reckless driving. A drunk driver. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The accident that had shaped the last 11 years of my life, that had damaged my relationship with my family beyond repair, had been caused by a drunk driver. Not by my alleged carelessness or inexperience, but by someone who made the decision to get behind the wheel while intoxicated. Why hadn't my parents told me this? Why let me believe I was responsible when there was clear evidence to the contrary? With growing unease, I scrolled through the rest of the document. There were references to additional files, including victim impact statements and court proceedings. I would need to request those separately. As I was about to close the document, a name caught my eye in one of the footnotes: Attorney Richard Warren, representing both victims, Melissa Warren and Amber Warren, in civil proceedings. My father had been our legal representative in whatever court case had followed the accident. Of course he had. It made perfect sense for a lawyer to handle his daughter's case personally. But it also meant he had seen this police report. He had known, without any doubt, that I was not at fault. The betrayal cut deep, leaving me breathless. For 11 years, he had let me believe I was responsible. For 11 years, he had nurtured my guilt, used it to control me, to keep me tethered to a family dynamic that served his purposes. And my mother had either been complicit or kept in the dark herself. I needed to know more. Specifically, I needed to know what had happened with the civil case my father had apparently pursued on our behalf. Had there been a settlement? Where had that money gone? With Amber's ongoing medical needs and specialized equipment, such funds would have been significant. The police report had opened a door to the truth, but I was only beginning to glimpse what lay beyond it. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching how to access court records. The path forward was clear. I needed to find out what had happened in the aftermath of the accident, what settlements had been reached, and most importantly, why my parents had maintained the fiction of my guilt when they knew, they had to have known, that I was innocent. But accessing court records would take time, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional capacity to wait. There was a more direct source of information available to me, though approaching it filled me with dread: my father's home office, with its meticulously organized files and records of every case he'd ever handled, including, presumably, ours. I hadn't been in that office since high school. It had always been off-limits, a sacred space where my father conducted the important business that the rest of us weren't privy to. But now, with the weight of 11 years of undeserved guilt driving me, I was ready to cross that threshold and face whatever consequences came with it. I texted my mother, asking if I could stop by the house the following day to pick up some old photo albums for a project I was working on. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did want to reclaim pieces of my past, just not in the way she assumed. Her response was typically disinterested. Sure. We'll be at Amber's physical therapy from 1 to 3. Use your key. The stage was set. Tomorrow, I would finally learn the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next day, I arrived at my parents' house just after 1:15 p.m., heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The familiar colonial with its perfect symmetry and freshly painted shutters seemed different somehow, less like the home of my childhood and more like a fortress hiding secrets I was about to breach. I used my key to enter, the house eerily quiet without my mother's constant activity or Amber's presence. For a moment, standing in the foyer with its polished hardwood and family portraits, carefully arranged to show Amber's milestones while minimizing mine, I considered turning back. Did I really want to know the truth? Would it change anything? But 11 years of carrying undeserved guilt strengthened my resolve. I deserved answers. My father's office was at the end of the hallway, its heavy oak door perpetually closed throughout my childhood, a physical barrier between his professional world and our family life. I turned the brass knob with trembling fingers, half expecting alarms to sound, announcing my trespass. The room was exactly as I remembered: dark wood bookshelves lined with legal tomes, the imposing desk with its green leather top, the smell of lemon polish and old paper. Family photos were conspicuously absent here. This was a space dedicated to Richard Warren, attorney at law, not Richard Warren, father. I moved directly to the filing cabinets along the far wall, labeled by year. 2012 would be where he kept records of the accident and subsequent legal proceedings. The drawer slid open with a soft metallic whisper, revealing hanging folders in perfect alphabetical order. I flipped through them: client names, case numbers, court dates. Nothing labeled with our names or family accident. Then I noticed a smaller filing cabinet behind the desk, its key still in the lock. The label on the front read simply "Personal." My stomach clenched. If my father kept records of our case anywhere, it would be here. The first drawer contained mortgage documents, insurance policies, and tax returns. The second held medical records, not just recent ones, but going back decades. My birth certificate, Amber's immunization records, Mom's mammogram results. The third drawer was labeled Legal Family. This was it. With unsteady hands, I pulled it open to find a single thick folder labeled Warren vs. Jenkins, 2012 to 2013. I lifted the folder onto my father's desk and opened it, revealing hundreds of pages of legal documents. Police reports, including the one I'd just obtained. Medical assessments of Amber's condition and prognosis. My own medical records from the accident. And then, what I was looking for, settlement documents. According to the papers in front of me, Walter Jenkins' insurance company had settled for $1.5 million for Amber's injuries and ongoing care. There was a separate settlement of $250,000 for my injuries and trauma. Both settlements had been finalized in December 2012, 7 months after the accident. $1.75 million total. The amount took my breath away. Where had that money gone? Amber's medical expenses were substantial, but our family had excellent insurance. And what about my portion? I'd never seen a penny of it, had taken out student loans for college despite supposedly having $250,000 in settlement money. A sick feeling washed over me as I continued reading. The settlement checks had been made out to Richard Warren as trustee for his minor daughters. There were bank statements showing the opening of accounts where the funds had initially been deposited. And then, transfers. Large sums moved from these accounts to others. Investment purchases. Property acquisitions. My father had used our settlement money meant to compensate for our injuries and suffering, for his own investments. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the documents. The evidence was undeniable. My father had misappropriated funds that legally belonged to his daughters. He'd committed not just a moral betrayal, but potentially a criminal act. As I desperately tried to process this revelation, a final document caught my eye. It was a letter from Jenkins' attorney, dated a week before the settlement was finalized. Part of it had been highlighted by my father. As discussed, our client deeply regrets the events of May 15th and acknowledges full responsibility for the accident. While no amount can compensate for the injuries sustained by your daughters, particularly Amber, we hope this settlement offers some measure of justice. We also understand your desire to shield your younger daughter from the knowledge that her injuries were caused by a drunk driver, though we maintain that full disclosure to both victims would be appropriate. The highlighted section hit me like a physical blow. My parents had deliberately kept the truth from us, not just from me, but from Amber too. She didn't know a drunk driver had caused her injuries. And while they had shielded her from this knowledge, they had allowed me to believe I was responsible. Why? The question burned in my mind. Why let me carry that burden? Why? What are you doing in here? My father's voice, cold with fury, came from the doorway. I hadn't heard the front door open, hadn't noticed the time slipping away as I uncovered his betrayal. I looked up to see him standing there, briefcase still in hand, face darkening as he registered the open filing cabinet. The documents spread across his desk. Dad. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, stronger than I expected, edged with an anger I'd never allowed myself to express. I know what you did. You have no right to be in here, he said, advancing into the room. Those are private legal documents. They're documents about me, I countered, standing my ground. About the accident. About the settlements you received on behalf of your minor daughters, settlements you apparently decided to invest for yourself. His face paled slightly, but his expression remained hard. You don't understand the complexities of managing that money. Everything I did was for this family's benefit. Was it for the family's benefit to let me believe I was responsible for Amber's injury? To let me carry that guilt for 11 years when you knew that a drunk driver ran a red light? My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. Was it for the family's benefit to use me as a scapegoat while you played with money that legally belonged to your daughters? A flash of something, shame? Fear crossed his face before his attorney mask slipped back into place. I protected both of you the best way I knew how. Amber didn't need to know her life was ruined by some drunk. And you needed to learn responsibility. To understand the consequences of your actions. What actions? I was shouting now, years of suppressed rage bubbling to the surface. I didn't do anything wrong. The police report clearly states I tried to avoid the collision. The other driver was drunk and ran a red light. Those are the facts, Dad. Facts you've known since 2012. Don't you raise your voice in my house, he snapped, lawyer mode fully engaged now. You don't understand what it was like. Watching your sister suffer. The surgeries, the therapy, knowing she'd never walk again. Someone had to be responsible. And there it was, the ugly truth. My father, the man who built his career on the premise of justice, couldn't accept that sometimes terrible things happen without anyone in the family being at fault. He needed a narrative where someone was to blame, and it couldn't be random chance. It couldn't be a stranger who made a terrible choice to drive drunk. It had to be someone he could control, someone he could punish and shape through that punishment. It had to be me. The realization was both devastating and freeing. My parents' treatment of me had never been about what I did or didn't do. It had been about their inability to process trauma, to accept the randomness of tragedy. Where's my settlement money? I asked, my voice steady now. The $250,000 that was meant for me. He waved dismissively. It was invested, along with Amber's funds. For the future. For the family. I want bank statements. I want to know exactly where that money went. And I want to know now. I gathered the settlement documents, clutching them to my chest. These are copies I'm taking with me. I'm sure you have the originals filed somewhere safe. The look of panic that crossed his face confirmed my suspicion. He never expected to be caught. He never imagined his dutiful, guilt-ridden daughter would dare to question his authority, to demand accountability. Melissa, be reasonable, he said, his tone shifting to the conciliatory voice he used in negotiations. Let's discuss this calmly. As a family. Oh, we'll discuss it as a family, I agreed. With Mom and Amber present. They deserve to know the truth too, all of it. Including what happened to the settlement money. The sound of the front door opening again interrupted our standoff. Mom's voice called out, Richard? Is that Melissa's car outside? Footsteps in the hallway, and then Mom appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the scene, me clutching documents, my father's flushed face, the open filing cabinet. What's going on? She asked, confusion evident in her voice. Then, noticing the label on the folder in my hands, why do you have those files? Before my father could speak, I turned to her. Mom, did you know the accident was caused by a drunk driver who ran a red light? Did you know Dad received settlements of $1.5 million for Amber and $250,000 for me? Money that seems to have disappeared into investments we've never seen. The color drained from her face. She looked at my father, a silent question in her eyes that told me everything I needed to know she hadn't known. Or at least, not everything. Diana, Melissa's confused about some legal matters that are really beyond her understanding, my father began, but Mom cut him off. Is it true, Richard? About the drunk driver. His silence was damning. Oh my God, she whispered. All these years, you let her think, we let her think. The sound of Amber's wheelchair approaching broke the moment. She appeared in the doorway, looking between the three of us with confusion. Hey, what's happening? Why is everyone in Dad's office? You guys look like someone died. I took a deep breath, looking at my sister, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time in years. Not as the golden child who had unwittingly become the center of our family's dysfunction, but as another victim. A young woman who had built her identity around a narrative as false as the one that had been forced on me. Amber, I said gently, we need to talk. There's something you should know about the accident. Something we all should have known years ago. As I looked at my sister's concerned face, I realized this conversation would change everything for our family. There would be no going back once the truth was spoken aloud. But after 11 years of living a lie, I was finally ready for whatever came next, even if it meant breaking apart what remained of our fractured family in order to build something honest from the ruins. I've been talking for a while now, and this is where the story reaches its turning point. Everything I've shared so far has been building to this moment of confrontation with my father. Before I continue with what happened next, how my sister reacted to the truth and the aftermath that followed, I'd love to know what you think. Would you have confronted your family like I did, or would you have handled it differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you're invested in finding out how this family drama resolves, hit that like button to help others find the story, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of my future videos. Now, let me tell you what happened when I finally revealed the truth to my sister. The silence that followed my words seemed to stretch into infinity. We had moved to the living room, neutral territory, with the incriminating documents spread across the coffee table. Amber's face had cycled through confusion, disbelief, shock, and now, as the truth sank in, a slow-building rage I'd never seen in my usually composed sister. "A drunk driver," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. All this time, it was a drunk driver who ran a red light. She looked at our father, blue eyes identical to his own now cold with betrayal. "And you knew? You let Melissa believe she was responsible for what happened to me." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his armchair, his earlier authority diminished. "I was trying to protect you both," he insisted, but the excuse sounded hollow even to him. "Protect us?" Amber's voice rose. "By letting Melissa carry guilt for something that wasn't her fault? By letting me believe my own sister was responsible for my condition?" She shook her head, blonde hair swinging with the force of the movement. "That's not protection, Dad. That's manipulation." Mom sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Richard, I don't understand. You told me the accident was complicated, that there were factors." She trailed off, the realization dawning that she too had been fed a carefully crafted version of events. "The legal situation was complicated," he replied, lawyer mode firmly engaged now. "Jenkins Insurance was trying to minimize liability. I had to focus on securing the best settlement possible for our daughters." "For our daughters," I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. "And yet neither of your daughters has seen a penny of that money." "Where is it, Dad? Where's the $1.75 million that was meant to compensate Amber and me for our injuries?" He sighed heavily, as if the weight of his deception had finally become too much to bear. "The money was invested. Property, primarily. The vacation home in Vermont. The rental properties in New Haven." Mom's gasp was audible. "The Vermont house? That's where Amber's settlement went." "It was an investment for her future," Dad insisted. "For all our futures. The rental income will eventually provide for her long-term care." "Eventually?" Amber's voice was ice. "Meanwhile, I've been working 2 jobs from my wheelchair to save for the adaptive vehicle I need, when there was my money that could have paid for it years ago." The revelation seemed to hit her like a physical blow. "And Melissa's college loans? Her portion could have covered those, couldn't it?" Dad had no answer for that. The silence was damning. "I want a full accounting," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Every dollar that was allocated to Amber and me. Where it went, what it was used for, and what remains. And I want it by the end of the week. You can't just demand." He began, but Mom cut him off. "Yes, Richard, they can. They absolutely can." Her voice shook, but her eyes were clear as she looked at her daughters. "I am so sorry. I didn't know the full truth, but I should have asked more questions. Should have pushed harder when things didn't add up." She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "Especially with you, Melissa. The way we treated you, there's no excuse." Her apology, while welcome, couldn't erase 11 years of emotional abuse. But it was a start. Amber reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "I never blamed you," she said softly. "Not really. Even when they said it was your fault, something never felt right about it. You were always so careful, so responsible." Her eyes filled with tears. "But I didn't defend you either. I let them treat you like you'd ruined my life, when all you ever did was try to be there for me." "I'm so sorry, Mel." The lump in my throat made it difficult to speak. After 11 years of being the family scapegoat, Having both my mother and sister acknowledge the wrong that had been done to me was overwhelming. But there was still the matter of the misappropriated settlement funds and the deeper betrayal they represented. I think I said carefully that we need to consult another attorney, someone who specializes in trustee malfeasance. Dad's head snapped up, alarm flashing across his features. You would take legal action against your own father? After everything I've done for this family. What you've done, Amber said, her voice hard, is steal from your daughters and gaslight them for over a decade. What would you call that, Dad? As an attorney, what would you recommend to a client whose trustee had misused their settlement funds? He had no answer. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal consultations, financial forensics, and painful family therapy sessions. We learned that of the original $1.75 million, approximately $800,000 remained, tied up in various investments. The rest had been spent, some legitimately on Amber's medical needs, but much of it on lifestyle expenses that benefited our parents far more than us. Through it all, the most difficult adjustment was recalibrating my entire self-image. For 11 years, I had defined myself as the sister who had caused the accident, the daughter who had to atone. My career choices, my romantic relationships, my geographic limitations, all had been shaped by that false narrative. Who was I without that burden of guilt? What did I want from life when I wasn't constrained by perceived obligation? These questions kept me awake at night, both terrifying and exhilarating in their possibilities. Amber faced her own identity crisis. I've been the victim for so long, she confided during one of our newly established sister lunch dates. Not just of the accident, but of this story they created. The perfect daughter whose life was ruined. It was exhausting living up to that image, you know? Never being allowed to be angry or messy or just normal. Our parents' marriage didn't survive the revelation. Mom moved out in July, unable to forgive Dad's deception or her own complicity in it. I should have questioned more, she told me during a tearful conversation. Should have noticed how he isolated you, used your guilt to control you. What kind of mother doesn't protect her child from that? Dad retreated into himself, alternating between defensive justification and grudging attempts at apology. The prestigious attorney found himself facing an ethics investigation when news of his mishandling of his daughter's settlement funds reached the State Bar Association. By August, the remaining settlement funds had been properly transferred to Amber and me. My portion, just over $100,000 after legal fees, felt like both a windfall and a painful reminder of what had been taken from me. Not just money, but years of my life spent beneath the weight of undeserved guilt. I used part of my funds to pay off my student loans. The rest I set aside, uncertain yet how I wanted to use it. For the first time in my adult life, I had options and the freedom to explore them. Fall arrived with a crisp sense of possibility. The Vermont property, purchased with Amber's settlement money, had been sold, the proceeds properly transferred to a trust in her name. She used part of the funds to buy the adaptive vehicle she'd been saving for, a specially modified SUV that gave her unprecedented independence. "Want to take a road trip?" she asked one Sunday afternoon in late September, keys dangling from her fingers. Just the two of us. No destination, no schedule. The old Melissa would have hesitated, checking mental calendars of family obligations and self-imposed limitations. The new Melissa simply smiled and said, "When do we leave?" We spent a week driving up the coast of New England, two sisters getting to know each other as adults without the poisonous family narrative between us. In a seaside inn in Maine, over glasses of wine and the sound of waves crashing against the shore, Amber asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between us. "Do you think you'll ever forgive him?" I didn't need to ask who she meant. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Part of me understands that he was traumatized too, seeing you injured, feeling helpless. Blame was his way of creating order from chaos. But understanding isn't the same as forgiveness." She nodded, turning her glass in her hands. "He stole more than money from us. He stole our relationship as sisters. Her eyes, so like our father's in color but warmer, more empathetic, met mine. I've missed you, Mel. All these years, I've missed who we could have been together. That night, I wept for the first time since the confrontation. Not from anger or betrayal, but from grief for the lost years and tentative hope for what might still be possible. When we returned from our trip, I made a decision that had been forming since the truth came to light. I resigned from my job and accepted the consulting position in New York I'd turned down years before. The company, impressed by my local success, had maintained interest in bringing me on board. "You're leaving?" Mom asked when I told her, her face reflecting a complex mix of emotions, sadness, guilt, and something that looked surprisingly like pride. "Not forever," I assured her. "Just expanding my horizons. I've spent 11 years defined by obligation and guilt. I need to find out who I am without those things." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "You deserve that chance." "I just wish." She trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. She wished she'd given me that chance years ago. Wished she'd protected me from becoming the family scapegoat. Wished she'd questioned the narrative my father had constructed. "I know, Mom," I said softly. "I know." Dad's reaction to my move was predictably self-centered. "So that's it? You discover one mistake I made trying to protect this family, and you abandon us." His legal troubles had humbled him somewhat, but not enough to truly acknowledge the depth of his betrayal. "It wasn't one mistake," I corrected him, my voice calm. "It was 11 years of deliberate deception. 11 years of letting me believe I'd ruined my sister's life when you knew that wasn't true. And it wasn't protection, it was control." He had no response to that. The ethics investigation had resulted in a 1-year suspension of his law license, a significant professional blow, but not the career-ending sanction it could have been. Still, his reputation in the community had suffered, and his marriage was over. The perfect family facade had crumbled, revealing the dysfunction beneath. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I continued. "I'll visit regularly. I'll still be part of Amber's life, a bigger part, honestly, now that we're rebuilding our relationship without your lies between us. But I need to build my own life too." As I packed up my apartment, sorting through possessions accumulated during years of stagnation, I found myself discarding more than I kept. The physical unburdening felt symbolic, a shedding of the weight I'd carried for so long. Taylor flew in from California to help with the move and to meet Amber properly for the first time in years. "I always knew something was off about how your parents treated you," she said as we loaded boxes into the moving truck. "But I never imagined anything this twisted." "Neither did I admitted. I just accepted that I deserved it." "And now?" she asked, studying my face. I considered the question carefully. "Now I know I didn't. And I'm learning what that means for who I get to be going forward." My new apartment in Brooklyn was smaller than my Connecticut place, but felt infinitely more spacious, perhaps because it wasn't cluttered with guilt and obligation. The consulting job was challenging, demanding skills I developed but never fully utilized under the constraints of my previous life. For the first few months, I focused entirely on building this new existence, excelling at work, exploring the city, making friends who knew nothing of my past, who saw me only as I was now, confident, capable, unburdened. Amber visited regularly, sometimes staying for long weekends, her wheelchair navigating city streets with the same determination she brought to everything. We developed new traditions, Broadway shows, obscure restaurants, museums neither of us had visited before. Each experience was a brick in the foundation of our rebuilt relationship. "I'm thinking of moving here," she announced during one such visit in early spring. "Not immediately, but maybe next year. There's a graphic design program at NYU I've been eyeing." The suggestion thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. "Are you sure? What about Mom?" Amber shrugged. "Mom's finding her own way. She's dating that high school English teacher, volunteering at the literacy center. And honestly, I need some distance from Connecticut too. Too many people still see me as poor Amber Warren there." I understood that desire to escape other people's perceptions all too well. You'd be welcome here anytime, I told her. But make sure you're doing it for yourself, not because you feel obligated to repair our relationship. She smiled, the genuine, unguarded smile that had been appearing more frequently lately. This isn't obligation, Mel. This is me choosing my sister. Something I should have done years ago. As spring turned to summer, I realized I'd passed the one-year anniversary of discovering the police report without even noticing, a sign, perhaps, that the past was finally loosening its grip. The therapy I'd continued in New York was helping me process not just the betrayal, but its aftermath, the anger, the grief, and the disorienting freedom of rewriting my own story. Dad's suspension ended, and he reopened his practice, though on a much smaller scale. We spoke occasionally, stilted conversations that danced around the deeper issues between us. Forgiveness still felt distant, but the raw wound of his betrayal had begun to scab over. In July, I met James at a work event, a cybersecurity specialist with kind eyes and an easy laugh who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. On our third date, when he inquired about my family, I told him the whole story, watching carefully for his reaction. "That's incredibly messed up," he said when I finished. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." No platitudes about forgiveness, no devil's advocate for my father's perspective, just simple acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. It shaped me in ways I'm still discovering, I admitted. Not all bad, necessarily. I'm resilient. I pay attention to the truth beneath people's words. But I'm still learning to trust my own perceptions after having them undermined for so long. He nodded, understanding. That makes sense. Thank you for trusting me with this. As I looked at him across the table, I realized something important. For the first time since the accident, I was sharing my story not as a confession, not weighted with shame and guilt, but simply as part of who I was. A chapter in a longer narrative that was still being written. The discovery of the police report had shattered the false reality my father had constructed. The confrontation had been necessary, painful, cleansing. The fallout had reshaped our family irrevocably. But it was the rebuilding of my sense of self, of my relationship with Amber, of a life based on truth rather than manipulation, that was proving to be the most profound transformation of all. 1 year after leaving Connecticut, I stood in my Brooklyn apartment, looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed with a text from Amber, confirming her acceptance to the NYU program. My calendar showed an upcoming dinner with James. My work inbox held praise for a recently completed project and an offer of promotion. None of these things would have been possible if I hadn't found my peace before. If I hadn't confronted the lies. If I hadn't begun the painful process of reclaiming my narrative. The journey wasn't over. There were still difficult conversations ahead, complex emotions to navigate, old patterns to unlearn. But standing there, looking at the life I was building from the ashes of the one that had been built for me, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Not just for what lay ahead, but for what had already been reclaimed: my relationship with my sister, my sense of self-worth, my right to define my own story. The truth, painful as it had been, had indeed set me free. 2 years after discovering the police report that changed everything, I found myself back in Connecticut for Thanksgiving, the first holiday the entire Warren family would attempt to spend together since the truth had come to light. Mom had suggested it, and after much deliberation, Amber and I had agreed. Dad, now living alone in a condo half the size of our family home, would join us at Mom's new place, a cozy craftsman bungalow that felt more like her than the colonial ever had. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" James asked as we drove from New York, his hand steady on the wheel. After a year of dating, he understood the complicated terrain of my family relationships better than most. "No," I admitted with a rueful smile. "But I'm as ready as I'll ever be." The woman who greeted us at the door barely resembled the perfectly coiffed homemaker of my childhood. Mom's hair, now streaked with natural gray, was cut in a stylish bob. She wore jeans and a bright sweater instead of her former uniform of tailored slacks and muted blouses. "You look happy," I observed as she embraced me. "I'm getting there," she replied, the simple honesty of her response a testament to how much had changed. The Diana Warren of before would have insisted everything was perfect, regardless of reality. Amber arrived next, maneuvering her wheelchair up the ramp Mom had installed at the side entrance. She'd moved to New York 6 months earlier and was thriving in her graduate program, her natural artistic talent finally being nurtured and developed. The sisters who had been driven apart by lies were now just a subway ride away from each other, rebuilding their relationship one dinner, one movie night, one heart-to-heart conversation at a time. Dad arrived last, the lines in his face deeper than I remembered, his confident stride diminished. He greeted James with stiff politeness and hugged Amber warmly. When he turned to me, there was an awkward moment of hesitation before I accepted his brief embrace. "You look well," he said, his eyes taking in my appearance, the confidence that had replaced my former tendency to make myself small, the stylish clothes that reflected my successful career, the absence of the perpetual guilt that had once shadowed my features. "I am well," I confirmed, neither hostile nor particularly warm. We had established an uneasy truce over the past year, occasional phone calls, and carefully worded emails that acknowledged our shared past without quite addressing it. Dinner was a strange blend of old and new dynamics. Mom had prepared traditional Thanksgiving dishes, but had abandoned the formal dining room in favor of a more casual table in the open kitchen. Conversation flowed more easily than I had expected, centered around neutral topics: Amber's studies, James's recent promotion, Mom's new book club. It was during dessert, pumpkin pie served on mismatched plates rather than the formal china of Thanksgivings past, that Dad cleared his throat, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his lawyer's voice abandoned in favor of something more vulnerable, more authentic. "About what happened. About the choices I made after the accident." The table fell silent. In the 2 years since the confrontation, he had offered explanations, justifications, and half-hearted apologies, but never a full reckoning with his actions. "When I saw you in that hospital bed, Amber," he continued, his voice unsteady, "and the doctors weren't sure if you'd walk again, something in me broke. I needed someone to blame. Someone I could punish, because I couldn't punish the drunk driver enough to make it right." He turned to me, his eyes swimming with tears. "And you were there. Young, vulnerable, under my control in a way the actual culprit wasn't. It was wrong. Deeply, unforgivably wrong." The silence that followed was weighted with 2 decades of family history, the golden child and the scapegoat, the perfect family facade hiding dysfunction and betrayal, the painful journey toward truth. "As for the money," he continued, "there's no excuse. I told myself it was for the family, for security, but the truth is simpler and uglier. I wanted control. Over the situation, over both of you. The settlement gave me that control, and I wasn't willing to relinquish it." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I've lost my marriage, damaged my relationship with both my daughters, tarnished my professional reputation. None of those consequences is unjust. They're the natural result of my actions." He looked directly at me then, the defensive armor entirely gone. "I don't expect forgiveness, Melissa. What I did to you is psychological abuse, plain and simple. I used your love for your sister as a weapon against you. Made you carry guilt that was never yours to bear. If you never forgive me, I would understand." The raw honesty of his words caught me off guard. For the first time, he wasn't minimizing, wasn't justifying, wasn't placing his intentions above the impact of his actions. He was simply acknowledging the truth, however damning. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said carefully. "Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But I appreciate your honesty today." He nodded, accepting this response as his due. "I've started seeing a therapist," he added, the admission clearly difficult for a man who had always prided himself on self-sufficiency. I should have done it years ago, after the accident. We all should have had help processing what happened, instead of creating this distorted reality where Melissa was to blame. We're all getting help now, Amber observed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Better late than never, right? The conversation shifted after that, less weighted but more authentic than any family discussion I could remember. We talked about hard things. The years of estrangement between Amber and me, Mom's gradual recognition of her role in enabling Dad's narrative, the challenging process of rebuilding trust. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Dad, loading dishes into the dishwasher, a mundane task that felt significant in its normalcy. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, handing me a rinsed plate. "Of the woman you've become despite everything. Your strength, your success. I didn't make it easy for you." "No, I agreed, you didn't. But I'm not who I am in spite of what happened. In some ways, I'm who I am because of it. The hard parts and the healing both." He nodded, understanding. "You know, when you found that police report, my first reaction was fear. Not just of legal consequences, but of losing the narrative I'd created, the one where I was the protective father doing what was best for everyone. It was easier than admitting I'd failed to protect both my daughters from a random act of violence, that some things are beyond our control." "Control is an illusion," I said, thinking of all the therapy sessions where I'd grappled with this very concept. "A comforting one, but an illusion nonetheless." "Indeed." He handed me the last dish. "For what it's worth, I am sorry, Melissa. Not just for what I did, but for who I was, the kind of father who could do that to his child. I'm trying to be better." I didn't say, "I forgive you." It would have been premature, perhaps even dishonest. But I did say, "I believe you're trying. That matters." And it did. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to allow for the possibility of a different kind of future, one built on truth rather than deception, on accountability rather than blame, on the messy reality of family rather than the perfect illusion we'd maintained for so long. Later that night, as James and I drove back to New York, he asked, "How are you feeling about everything?" I considered the question carefully, watching the familiar Connecticut landscape give way to the New York skyline. "I'm okay," I said finally. "Not perfect. Not completely healed. But okay." "Your family has come a long way," he observed. "We have," I agreed. "From perfect on the outside and broken on the inside to something more authentic. Imperfect, still healing, but real." The journey from victim to survivor to thriver wasn't linear. There were still days when the old guilt threatened to resurface, when I doubted my worth, when the echoes of my father's manipulations reverberated in my mind. But those days grew fewer as time passed, as I surrounded myself with truth-tellers who affirmed rather than undermined my reality. Amber and I continued to strengthen our sisterhood, free from the poisonous dynamic our father had created. Mom found new purpose in volunteer work supporting families affected by drunk driving. Dad's progress was slower, more halting, but genuine in its own way. As for me, I built a life that honored both what I had endured and what I had overcome. My relationship with James deepened into a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. My career flourished as I stepped fully into my capabilities, unburdened by the limitations I'd once accepted as my due. I even began speaking occasionally at victim support groups, sharing my experience of carrying undeserved guilt and the liberation that came with reclaiming my narrative. The discovery of that police report had been both an ending and a beginning, the end of a false reality constructed to serve my father's need for control, the beginning of a journey toward authentic selfhood and genuine connection. 3 years after finding the report, I stood in a small courtroom witnessing Walter Jenkins' parole hearing. He had served his sentence for the DUI that changed our lives and was eligible for early release. Amber had chosen not to attend, but I felt compelled to see the face of the man who had set our family tragedy in motion. He was older than I expected, diminished by years in prison, his eyes downcast as he expressed remorse for his actions. I had prepared a victim impact statement, but when the moment came to deliver it, I found myself deviating from my planned words. The accident caused by Mr. Jenkins' decision to drive drunk changed many lives forever, I began, my voice steady. My sister lost her ability to walk. I lost years of my life to undeserved guilt. Our family was fractured in ways that are still healing. Those consequences are real and lasting. I paused, aware of Jenkins watching me with a mixture of shame and apprehension. But I've learned something important in the past few years. Holding on to anger and blame only continues the damage. I don't minimize what happened or its impact. But I recognize that Mr. Jenkins is more than the worst choice he ever made, just as I am more than the worst thing that ever happened to me. The hearing concluded with a decision to grant parole with strict conditions. As I left the courtroom, Jenkins' sister approached me. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your grace today. Walter has worked hard to change, to make amends in whatever ways he can." I nodded, not quite ready for more interaction, but acknowledging her words. The woman who had once carried the weight of an entire family's dysfunction was learning the power of boundaries, of choosing when and how to engage. That evening, I FaceTimed with Amber to tell her about the hearing. Our weekly virtual dinners had become a cherished ritual, a way to maintain our connection despite busy lives. "Do you think we'll ever be completely over it?" she asked as our conversation wound down. The accident, everything that came after. I considered the question carefully. I don't think we get over it exactly. I think it becomes part of our story, but not the whole story. Not the defining chapter anymore. She nodded, understanding. I like who we are now, Mel. Who we're becoming. I just wish we hadn't lost so many years getting here. Me too, I admitted. But we're here now. And we're moving forward together. That's what matters most. As we said our goodbyes, promising to meet for brunch that weekend, I reflected on the long, winding path that had led us here. From a 17-year-old girl suddenly burdened with undeserved guilt to a woman who had reclaimed her narrative and rebuilt her life on a foundation of truth. From sisters estranged by lies to sisters united in healing. From a family fractured by trauma to individuals finding their own paths toward wholeness. The discovery of that police report had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come in its aftermath, in the courage to confront the truth, the strength to weather the fallout, and the resilience to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. My story wasn't over. None of our stories were. But the pages yet to be written would be authored by truth rather than deception, by choice rather than obligation, by the authentic selves we were still discovering beneath the roles we'd been assigned. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful resolution of all. I hope my story has resonated with you in some way. Perhaps you've experienced family betrayal, carried undeserved guilt, or had to rebuild your life after discovering a painful truth. I'd love to hear your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments below. This journey of healing and reclaiming my narrative continues every day, and sharing it with you has been part of that process. If this story touched you, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more authentic conversations about family dynamics, healing from trauma, and finding your truth. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they aren't defined by the narratives others have created about them. Thank you for being here with me today, and remember, sometimes the hardest truths lead to the most beautiful beginnings.